Hello everyone, my name is Christopher Donald. Welcome to my channel, and I'm going to be doing a demonstration video on mixing plaster for basically making a hump mold. You can use plaster for a lot of different things in ceramics. We use it for making molds. We use it for surfaces that we're going to use for reclaiming clay, for like wedging tables. Plaster is it's a gypsum product. It is basically, it's used because it absorbs water really well, dries out really well, and is fairly sturdy. Um, One thing to think about when you're casting plaster is that plaster it is harmful to breathe it. I'm not wearing a respirator for the sake of this demo, but I highly recommend that you wear at least an N95 when you're working with dry plaster, especially if you're in an enclosed space and you don't have good ventilation. So, said, let's go ahead and jump in here. So the mold that I'm going to be using for my hump mold is actually a light fixture. I really like these, and I really like chocolate molds. This is like it's a clip-on light fixture. So this little thing would go through the hole on here, and it's an acrylic plastic, and it's a little bit flexible, nice and smooth. And what's great about this is that it's a perfect half sphere. I can fill it with plaster, pop it out really easily because it has a little bit of flex to it, and it makes a fantastic hump mold. Hump molds are when you're shaping the clay on the outside of the mold. Drape molds are when you're putting the clay inside the mold. So they're just two different parts of the same thing. If I wanted to make this into a drape mold, I would cast the plaster on the back side, and then that would give me the inside. The reason I prefer working with hump molds over drape molds is that it allows me access to the foot. Usually that's the point, that's the part that you really need to try and get at. If you do it in a drape mold or with free draping, you have to let it get more like medium to late leather hard in order to actually put a foot on it. So there's a little bit more monkeying around with the drying times and that. If I do it on a hump mold like this, I can put my slab right over the top of it. I can immediately add a foot, and the two of them can dry together and pop off at the same time. So it's really convenient. I'll be doing a video on using these molds as well in a little bit. One thing I forgot here, there's a little hole on the bottom. I like to put a piece of tape on that. It doesn't take much to cover this up. That's just so the plaster doesn't go pouring straight through the hole. There we go, a little bit of Scotch tape. That's all you need. This is a very smooth, shiny acrylic plastic. I don't need any kind of a resist inside of this. A resist is something that you would use on a surface which is porous or that the plaster is going to have a tendency to want to stick to. A good resist is Murphy's oil soap, not the premix, but the concentrate. And you can just brush that on, and that's a great one because it'll wash off of the plaster later. So if you do need a resist, I recommend Murphy's oil soap. This does not need a resist. I'm going to kind of approximate the volume of this, and I want to take some measurements as I am preparing my plaster. Now, to prepare my plaster, I want to put water into the container first, and I want to use cold water. Plaster is essentially a crystalline structure, and crystals and gypsum products that form crystals like concrete, plaster, those crystals are stronger and they form larger if it has a little bit more time to set and if it sets cold. So I want to use cold water. I'm going to take a guess at this and say I'm probably going to want to start with about 3 cups of water. Actually, let's call it 2.5. So I want to actually measure as I go and kind of keep notes on how much I've used. So this is 4 cups. I'm going to go down to 1.5. There we go. And I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, nope, I'm going to need 3. I can add more, but I'm starting off with 3, and then I'll make a note that I use 3 cups. That might change, but the reason I want to keep track of how many cups of water, and I'm going to weigh the plaster, the reason I'm doing that is because I want to be able to make a lot of these. So I'm going to be casting like 4 or 5 of these today. And I don't want to have to be eyeballing it each time. I pretty much want to be able to say, okay, this took 3.5 cups of water, put it in. It took this many grams of plaster, put it in, mix it, I'm done. So if you're going to do more than one, kind of optimize your process a bit. So this is already got the water in it, and I can set my scale to, going to change it to grams. There we go. I'm going to tare it with the water already on here. So now I'm only measuring the plaster that's going into it. And what I'm trying to do is put the plaster in kind of evenly distributed into the water. So don't just pour it all into the middle. I'm going to kind of put it into the water, working my way around. In general, you're going to want half the amount of water volume that you're going to want plaster. So if I wanted 2 cups of plaster, I would use 1 cup of water and put plaster dust into it until it gets me to approximately 2 cups. All right, so if I put in 713 grams, what I'm looking for here is I want to get to a point where the plaster is forming little islands and it's not quite soaking in immediately. So as I'm doing this, it's kind of absorbing pretty fast, but now I've got a little island forming here, a little bit of one there, and I think I'm almost at where I'm going to want this. So I'm going to sprinkle a bit more into the areas where it's still a lot of water, make sure it's nice and even. And to me, that's looking pretty good. I'm going to look at what my weight is, and I might put a little bit more in there just so that it's a sane number. All right, 1,030 grams. It's a little bit better than it being some weird odd number. So 1,030 grams of plaster. All right, now I've got little wet islands that have kind of formed, and a couple of tricks for when you're mixing up your plaster. The first one is that if you want your plaster to be especially dense and durable, you're not going to use your hand and mix this right away. You can use something else, some other object, but if I use my hand to mix this, the heat from my skin is going to start activating the plaster. And I would like this to actually sit for about 10 minutes and hydrate. I want those dry particles of plaster to absorb water, but not to start chemically setting yet. And that's going to make for a much stronger plaster product. Oh, and I didn't mention, I'm just using plaster of Paris. That's basically what pottery plaster is. There's a couple of different kinds. There's molding plaster, pottery plaster, plaster of Paris, and they're all essentially the same product. So buy whichever one is cheapest. For ceramics use, it does not matter all that much. The only time a lot of this becomes critical is with slip casting molds. Slip casting molds, there are formulas online for specific proportions of plaster to water that give you very specific absorption rates of that final plaster, which is very important when you're doing slip casting. But for any of this other kind of casting where you're just putting a semi-solid clay onto it or into it, it doesn't matter all that much. You can just follow what I'm showing here. So I would want to let this sit for 10 minutes, and then I would come back and just mix this with my hand. So we're going to pretend 10 minutes has gone by. It's a hump mold. It doesn't matter all that much for what I'm doing. So I'm going to use my hand, and I'm going to mix this up. I'm going to squeeze out any of the lumps. This is not harmful to be touching. The only thing it might do is if you let it start setting and drying on your skin, it's going to suck all the oil out of your skin. So you'll end up with kind of dry, cracked skin. But that's just because it's acting as a desiccant. There's not anything that this is going to do to you chemically. The only time that plaster and skin contact is a little bit more tricky is if you're doing body casting and you're doing, say, like a whole torso. As plaster sets, it heats up, and the larger the volume of plaster, the hotter it gets. So if I did a hand mold, it won't ever get hot enough to actually hurt. If I do a torso mold, it can get hot enough to give you a second-degree burn. So there's some tricks to that for getting the mold off of people before it starts to fully set. And I can do a video on that at some point. It's not strictly like the ceramic thing that everybody does right away, but I'll get it out there bit by bit. There's also some tricks for doing face casting where the plaster sets almost instantly so that people don't freak out with plaster on their faces. All right, what I'm looking for here is I want the plaster to be the thickness of like heavy whipping cream. So I want it, when I dip my hand into it, I want it to fill and cover the wrinkles in my knuckles. And if it's like that, then it's pretty much the right consistency. So it is covering the wrinkles in my knuckles, and I feel good about that. Now, I'm going to wash my hands off. I'm going to use cold water to do that. So I'm going to go rinse this off real quick. If you're putting plaster down a sink, use lots of cold water. Make sure it's very well diluted, and just run it down the sink for a couple of seconds after you're done, and you shouldn't have any problems with it clogging your sinks or your drains. Okay, so I have a little thing to just kind of help support my mold because it is a full dome half round. And I'm just going to go ahead and pour my plaster into it. Like I said, I don't need any kind of a resist or anything. And then we'll see how we did as far as estimating. All right, I'm a little shy. So I would then mix up another small batch. But before I do that, I'm going to make sure that I knock the air bubbles out of this batch. So I want to be, I can add more plaster to this while it's setting. It's not going to bother it at all. But I do want to make sure that any bubbles that are sticking to the outside surface of this, where it's going to be the part that I'm casting against, I just want those to come off of the surface and kind of move into the plaster more. And I can do that just by vibrating. And you'll actually see bubbles kind of coming up to the surface and popping. And so I'll just kind of keep tapping this and getting those air bubbles to move up. And I can then let this sit and start setting while I mix up just another, looks like I needed my whole full 4 cups. Good to know. So I'll just mix up a little more plaster and put that right in there. Some tricks for ways to kind of extend your plaster. Let me get a stick for thumping this real quick. There we go. I want to actually kind of tap this on the underside as well. Make sure that those ones are moving up. So if you have old plaster, like old plaster molds, they get damaged and you're just not going to use them anymore, you can break those into chunks and soak them in water. And then once they've fully soaked up the water, you can put them into your new plaster castings as an aggregate. Excuse me. Basically like you're making concrete instead of cement, the way that they'll put stones in as an aggregate for concrete. So you can take chunks of wet plaster, and I would probably put in like the fresh plaster, and then you can just push the chunks of wet, like preset plaster into that, maybe a little bit more on top, but it will just kind of become one with the new wet plaster that you're putting in there. And we do that a lot when we're making like wedging tables. We'll take all of our old plaster molds and we'll just, the ones that we don't use or they're damaged, smash them up, soak them in water. And this stuff's not cheap. I mean, this is $20 for a 13-pound bag, and a 50-pound bag is more. It saves you quite a bit. And especially for like tables and hump molds and that kind of thing, it makes no difference in the usability. All right, I put my other extra cup of water in here. I'm going to make a note. That is going to be 4 cups of water. And now I'm going to measure, I zeroed it out again, measure the amount of additional plaster. I can take a guess. I could just divide the last amount by 3, and that'll probably be how much I need. So let's say it's going to be around 300 some grams. I was happy with that consistency, so that proportion of water to plaster seemed good. So I'll just go ahead and go to 300 and see how that looks. Yep, totally happy with that. We're going to call that another 300. So 1,330 grams to make a whole one of these. I'll go ahead and just get this mixed up. In this case, I would not probably let this little bit hydrate because I want to kind of get it mixed in with the other batch before this starts to set, just so that they're a little more homogeneous. Perfect world. For the next one, I will mix it all at once, and it will go together perfectly. Now, if this hasn't set hardly at all, which this hasn't, I'm actually going to pour some of this back in here. Go my sponge and clean that outside up. And just mix these two together. So now I've got one consistency of plaster instead of pouring one into the other one. It's going to create air bubbles again, so I'm going to do the thumping all over again, but well. Okay, so that is my plaster. Let me rinse this off real quick. Always rinse things off with cold water as quickly as you can. That's going to minimize the amount of cleanup that you've got, and it'll make it a lot easier for the excess to go down the sink and not cause a problem. So I just added all the air bubbles right back into this when I poured that second batch, so I'm going to go ahead and pump it again. You can see those air bubbles coming up. Blot my little drips of plaster off my canvas there. Try and keep things clean. Okay, so there we go. That is pretty much the casting. Now, once this sets up, I'm going to take and pop it out. Use a surform, probably put a little bevel around the outer edge, and I'm good to go. Now these ones, I like to keep these solid just because people tend to put them on small turntables, and so I think it's nice to have this whole flat section to work with. But for myself, I actually wait until this is starting to set where it becomes gelatinous. You'll go through a couple stages. So first it's very watery. Then it'll start to set and it'll become like jelly, like jello. And then it's going to get more or less solid, but cold. Then it will start to warm up. After it's heated up and it starts to cool down again, it's done setting chemically, and I can pop it out at any point. Don't try and pop it out before it heats up and then cools down, because it's very weak at that at that point, and you're going to end up damaging your mold when you take it out. So if I wanted to, I could wait until this gets kind of jelly-like and use a metal tool like a trimming tool and actually just scoop out a couple of like half crescents and make myself a little handle. It's actually kind of nice for taking the piece and like removing it from the casting that you've done on it. I think I'll actually show that with this video. So I'm going to step away for a minute. This will take about 35 to 40 minutes to start setting to get jelly-like. And we'll come back and I'll show you that scooping out process and cleaning it up. Right back. All right, we're back, and it has been 17 minutes. This is now at a kind of jelly-like state. You can see it doesn't move or flow freely anymore. And this is the point where I would want to carve in my handles, if I'm going to do that. So I'm just going to make a little line here to mark the center. And then I just like using one of my steel ribs, and I'm going to keep all this plaster, and I'm just digging down into it. It's soft enough at this point that I can use a rib for this rather than using a trimming tool. And just do this gradually. Now, part of the reason why I'm using this tool at this stage is that it's going to create less dust, less small pieces of material. A little bit safer to do it while it's wet like this. And all of the excess plaster that I'm scooping out of here, I'm going to keep it and I'm going to put it into the next mold. So I'll use it as an aggregate in my next plaster mold. So it won't go to waste. All right, just getting this cleaned out. I want to leave a really good thickness for that wall, at least an inch. You're not going to want to cut it any closer than that. And like I said before, this isn't really about like weight reduction or anything. This is just about giving you something that you can grip when you're using the mold and trying to remove it from the piece that you've cast on top of it. But anything worth doing is worth doing ridiculously precisely, so I'm going to make it look good anyway. Right, they gave me the basic curve, and then if I want to get underneath it, so it kind of has a place where I can grip it, I'm going to use a different tool. I like using a trimming tool like this, so I can kind of cut underneath. I'll just scrape that out carefully. Actually, that's not working out as the best angle. Let me try another one. That's better. Sometimes you just got to find the right tool to get in there at the angle that you need it to. This one's kind of going underneath a little bit better. The one wasn't quite an abrupt enough angle. I just want to be able to kind of fit my fingertips, my thumb underneath that. So it's not just a straight cut in. I'm actually going underneath this middle part just a little bit. Here we go. It's still jelly-like, but it's starting to set up a little bit more now. I can kind of feel it wanting to push back against me scraping it, where when I first started, it took almost no pressure to move the tool through the plaster, and I can just double check that. That feels pretty good. And honestly, if I want, I can clean it up a little bit more later when it's stiffer, and I'll remove less material if I do that. Sometimes it's smart to not do everything when it's this soft, just because you can slip and then you've kind of like taken off more than you were expecting. So I'm a little conservative at this stage, but I'm still gonna round that edge off just a little bit. There we go. I'm happy with that. So the next step is going to be letting this continue setting. It had been about 17 minutes for it to get to this stage. I'd say it'll be another 15 minutes before it starts warming up. It's nowhere near that yet. Super cold, mushy, so I got to wait until this starts to heat up, and then it'll heat up and start to cool down. At the moment it starts to cool down, I'll be back. I'll show popping this out, cleaning it up the last of the way, and we'll be all done. All right, be right back. All right, welcome back. And it has now been another 15 minutes since I was last talking to you, and this has heated up, cooled down, significantly harder now, and it's ready to be popped out of the mold. So, because this is flexible, I can just basically bend it a little bit, and that allows some air to get in between the plaster and the plastic. And then I'll just pop it out. There we go. And out it comes. You got to love how these look when you do your first couple out of here. Just it any kind of castable gypsum product is going to take on the sheen of the surface that you're casting it on. And I mean, that's like mirror finish. I actually see my reflection in it. So perfect finish there. I've got a little bit of a blip in the middle, which is where there's the hole, and I've put my tape. But that's not going to really interfere with somebody using this later on. So now I would take and clean up, if I need to clean up this flat surface, I can with a Surform. I can put a little bit of a bevel on the edge here. I always want to bevel this. I don't want a really sharp edge because the plaster is just going to have a tendency to crack and chip if I leave a real fine edge there. So you want to do at least a 1/4 inch bevel. And sometimes I'll clean this up a little bit if there's any blobs on it to make it nice and flat. And the reason why you want to not have a lot of little bits chipping off of plaster is that if you get little pieces of plaster inside your clay, even after it's been glaze fired, that plaster can absorb moisture and it can expand inside the fired clay and just pop it out. So it's actually really destructive to get into things. And right here, if I want to, I can use my metal rib and I can kind of scrape that a little bit more if I still want to clean it up at all. But, honestly, that's in pretty good shape. I'd probably just leave it. And if I wanted to do any final cleaning on any of these little rough surfaces, just use a green scrubby pad, a little bit of water, scrub that, it'll be nice and perfect. I've got a handle here now so that if I put something over this, put a foot on it, and then I go to put it on a board, I can now flip it and just pull this right off the top. Makes it really easy to work with. So there we go. That's doing a full casting and cleanup process for a hump mold. Now I've got a little leftover material here, and I would just put this into the next mold. Don't waste this plaster. All these little scraps and everything, I can just throw it right in. And, I paid good money for this, so I might as well stick it inside the next one and use it for my next mold. All right. Thanks for joining me, and we'll have some more videos coming at some point on doing a couple other casting processes. And I'm definitely going to be showing using these molds and also using some other ways of draping for doing hand building. All right. Thanks for joining me. See you next time. Bye.